Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Michael Finnegan, president of Atlantic Media, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the festival and to our conversation on China and what it means for our national security, our personal finances, and our collective future. We're going to have a good conversation about it. There are more middle-class Chinese citizens today than there are people in all of America. That Chinese middle class is growing rapidly, fueling urbanization and development at an incredible rate. As a result, China continues to expand its reach, capitalizing on markets and resources across the world. It has become an essential economy in international affairs and an economic rival to the United States. Perhaps, as a product of that competition, a trade war continues to escalate. President Trump has accused the Chinese of unfair trade practices, and the two nations are locked in a retaliatory tariff tit-for-tat. Say that 3 times fast. One that will likely drive up prices on nearly every product imported from China and have a significant impact on the global economy. If that wasn't enough, China also directly impacts American national security. As these two global superpowers compete for supremacy, challenges in almost every field emerge, from cybersecurity to geopolitics to technological advancements to space travel and so on and so on. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack this afternoon. We've got an excellent panel today, but before we begin, please silence any of your cell phones, but don't put them away. We welcome you to join the conversation on Twitter, and you can tweet about this conversation using the hashtag #TheAtlanticFest, all one word. And we'll have plenty of time for your questions today, so be ready for those at the conclusion of the prepared remarks. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome our panelists. We have Amy Selico, a principal at the Albright Stonebridge Group and the former senior director for China Affairs at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Eli Ratner, vice president and director of studies at Center for a New American Security, and before that, deputy national security advisor to Vice President Joe Biden. And leading the conversation is the Atlantic's national correspondent, James Fallows. Jim, take it away.
Michael, thank you very much. Thanks to Amy and Eli for joining us. Thanks. Thanks to all of you. I think you all recognize, because I believe this is a very sophisticated China crowd, looking around, seeing how many people I know here, that, yes, so there's exactly one challenge we're going to have in the time ahead of us, which is condensing what could be months' worth of conversation to the next hour or so. So we'll try to do that in as lively a way as we can. I'll lead a conversation with Amy and Eli for the first while, then we'll have questions from all of you. And I think we're all trying to figure out what is going on. As they say in D.C., figuring out what the hell is going on between the U.S. and China. What strikes me is that an oversimplified way to think of U.S.-China relations is that we have to know at least 3 things, all of which are unpredictable. One is what's happening in China, one is what's happening in the United States, and one is what's happening between the U.S. and China. And that leaves aside Japan and the Koreas and Russia and Europe and the rest of Asia and all the rest. But we'll try to see how we can weave those threads together, what's happening in each of the countries, what's happening between them. Amy, I'd like to start with you. Just give us a big picture, if you would, this moment in U.S.-Chinese relations. It looks like it could either be heading off the rails or heading to something more constructive if the current administration's approach has any effect. Give us an initial sort of big picture framing of this moment.
Well, it's great to be here, and thank you very much. I think just diving right in, we're on the eve of the 40th anniversary of normalization of U.S.-China relations, and I think it's pretty fair to say that we are at the most challenging point in U.S.-China relations in about 30 years, since the aftermath of 1989 in Tiananmen Square. China did something, the United States reacted, it resulted in a real chill in the relationship that went well beyond the diplomatic or political spheres. And there are lasting impacts of that today, as we know. Some sanctions are still on China from 1989, and we're hearing more and more about them now as we talk about export controls. And so just to simply answer the question, I think it is safe to say that there are many in Beijing and in Washington who are saying this is going to be a new normal. This state of heightened tensions between the United States and China. And so very much apropos of this panel discussion, really I think the central question is, on the global stage, what does that mean when U.S.-China relations are at such a very, very significant low?
Great, thank you. Eli, your initial framing of where we are, all these years after normalization, after Tiananmen, what's your opening gambit here?
Well, thanks, Jim. I think where we are is that we experienced decades from normalization where there was a period of convergence between the United States and China in terms of our interests and our expectations. And I would argue, the presidency of Xi Jinping started to turn China away from that in terms of how he's governing his own country and China's role in the world. And what that has done is created increasing incompatibility between U.S. visions of the regional order in Asia as well as international politics. So I think for me, we're at a moment, given the direction that Xi Jinping is taking China, that was largely inevitable. I think Donald Trump is mostly an irrelevant figure to this story. I think it would have happened without him. It would have happened differently. It would have happened without him, and it's going to continue after him. So, and I don't think this is sort of an inflection to which we get back to a better point. I think as long as Xi is taking China in this direction, the United States and China are headed toward a much more competitive relationship.
I'm going to spend a minute talking about my own views on this. I've lived with my wife Deb in China for a long time, and just for the December 2016 issue of The Atlantic, which has the nightmare situation of it went to press before the election happened, and it came out after the election happened. Every 4 years we have to do something that is kind of permafrost or evergreen, depending on no matter who wins. And the piece I did for The Atlantic in that issue was essentially saying, what if China is going bad? What if, these decades worth of assumption, not necessarily of democratization, of convergence, but of manageability, if they had changed? That is and I was saying that the response would require a really sort of sophisticated, nuanced, public-private approach to China. That's my setup to ask you, Amy, on the trade front in particular, did China start this? And if so, does that matter?
Yeah, great question. I do think that China started this. A lot of the tensions between the U.S. and China on trade issues really began, I would argue, actually prior to Xi Jinping. We can think back to Hu Jintao's starting of indigenous innovation, really where China started to say, in order for the China market to grow, we have to restrict the participation of foreign investors in the market. And that really did truly contravene the commitment China made when it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. And many of us in the United States saw and experienced a lot of growth and liberalization initially in the 2000s in China. However, that started to restrict. And it really actually does predate Xi Jinping, where the Chinese economy, I think public policy leaders, and of course, as Eli knows, Xi Jinping was vice president during this time, started to say, we want to make sure that Chinese industry benefits maybe more than we want to adhere to the global rules of the road that we signed up to. And so I do believe that absent President Trump, the United States has been feeling this increased pressure from China giving us a raw deal, to speak in the parlance of the president now, but just that China didn't live up to its commitments. And so the United States had to change course, and rather than solely focus on continuing to engage Chinese authorities, think about how do we have to fight back against what China is doing to our interests because they're not adhering to the rules of the road.
And so, Eli, would you extend that again a little bit on how this started, but now how you think it is playing out and what the next steps, especially on trade, are likely to be, or the end game?
Well, this question of the end game is really important, and I know Amy would have some views on this as well, because people within the Trump administration have different views on what the end game might be. There are some who are focused on the trade deficit, others who are focused on manufacturing, others on the high technology issue, and then I think an emergent crowd within the administration that hasn't gotten enough attention, with the exception of the expert community, which is actually, and it's not just sort of the politicals and the Steve Bannons and the Peter Navarros and the politicals around Trump, but actually sophisticated strategic thinkers at the Defense Department, within this national...
You'll note that distinction.
Real professionals, real strategists who are thinking about this conception of decoupling, which is really fundamental to this. People who believe that the vulnerabilities associated with being overly interdependent with China is the problem in and of itself. And so there's this notion Trump's building, been this popular notion in the media and elsewhere, Trump is building leverage, he's building leverage, he's building leverage, he's trying to make a deal, he's trying to make a deal, he's trying to make a deal. There's a crowd inside who's saying, there is no deal. The tariffs are the end point. It's actually about, we're not going to go to a Soviet Cold War style where we don't interact at all, but we are going to decouple our economies. We're going to make our technology less vulnerable, our industries less vulnerable, both to Chinese theft as well as Chinese coercion. And so I think the debate is over the extent of that decoupling. I think it's very unlikely that we get a deal and this whole thing goes away, because we were just chatting in the back a little bit. If Donald Trump came out tomorrow and said, similar to what he did with NAFTA, and said, hey, we've got a new deal with China, it wouldn't be that the national security establishment would be applauding. It would be the Democrats and everyone else saying, no, we got major problems with China, and they would outflank him on the trade issue. So the issue is not going to go away, even if Trump wanted it to.
And before I ask you, Amy, about some of these endgame issues which you're seeing in your daily work, I just wanted to have a confirm something I believe is the case. My understanding is that Peter Navarro, the leading China authority in the administration, had never been to China until last year. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding as well, yes.
So, Amy, I
do have to say, I think it's important not to belittle some of the folks within the administration that are doing serious thinking on these issues. There are people thinking strategically, writing strategically, thinking about the long term, who are professionals, who have lived in China for a long time, understand the country. This isn't just, they're working at different levels, and we're seeing different expressions of it, but it's not just a couple renegades making policy.
Yes, that is a fair and important point, and thanks for making it. I mentioned Peter Navarro because he's been the public face of this in a way that, say, Stephen Miller, for example, has been the face of immigration policy, and so that was just that point I wanted to establish. So, Amy, you were saying earlier, before we went on stage, that your daily work now involves institutions in the U.S. that are part of this end game, whether there's going to be decoupling, as Eli suggests, whether there's going to be some kind of deal. What can you tell us about the way U.S. institutions, universities, corporations, et cetera, are navigating this period?
Yes, my day job is at Albright Stonebridge Group, where we're helping a number of for-profit and not-for-profit entities operate outside of the United States. The China practice has always been our largest single-country practice, on the one hand because a lot of opportunity, on the other hand because it's so difficult to operate in China. And so, as I was saying prior to this discussion, I have universities, foundations, corporations who were trying to assist navigate this challenging time. And very much to the point that Eli just made, this concept of decoupling has a lot of my clients very, very concerned. And this idea that the end game is to restrict interaction between our two economies has washed over my clients in a very, very difficult way, to the point where I was sitting in a boardroom and a number of corporations executives who were present said, are the Trump administration's tariff policies meant to punish China's bad behavior on intellectual property theft, or punish us for having global supply chains? Increasingly, when we talk about the end game of decoupling, my clients are thinking, it's about us. It's about whatever means necessary to get us out of China and back into the United States. So with this perspective, whether it's a university or a corporation operating in China, they're trying to figure out right now, is there a way for them to continue to have ties in China with this increasingly toxic rhetoric going on between the United States and China. China accusing the United States of bullyism, of course the United States saying that there's undue influence from China throughout our society that is bad for the United States.
I'm going to follow up one point about that before turning to Eli for a strategic question. I've spent a lot of my reporting life in southern China in the supply chain factories there, in Foxconn and all the rest of the places where most of our electronics are made, and I am just stunned by what would be involved in trying to recreate that in California and Texas, in Wisconsin or wherever else. Have your clients thought through the institutional implications of, say, the American educational system if Chinese students were fobbed off, or how long it would take to recreate a supply chain here? Would it be feasible to recreate, say, an electronic supply chain?
It's an interesting question because this last tranche of tariffs that the Trump administration put into place, of course, they set the tariff rate on the Chinese goods coming into the United States at 10% until January 1st, when the tariff goes up to 25%. And supposedly, part of that rationale was to give American companies time to move their supply chains. And that's, as you know, Jim, completely unrealistic. That supply chains could be moved that quickly. And speaking to the American universities that I represent, that they somehow could find other students to populate their classrooms, whether it's in China or here in the United States, if we start to restrict visas. This can't happen in a matter of months. It's going to take a long time, but I will say, certainly for my corporate clients, they are thinking about supply chains. TPP was one area where they could have diversified those chains and were very enthusiastic about it. In the absence of that, I do think many of my companies are thinking about where do they go to diversify supply chains. I don't think the United States is the top choice.
Yeah. So, Eli, do you want to say anything about supply chains? And if not, I have a different subject to raise with you.
Well, just very briefly, I think, again, the folks who are thinking about this, I don't think they're all thinking about just bringing this business back to the United States. If it was in Vietnam or Indonesia or Malaysia rather than China, I think that would achieve much of what they're trying to do here.
Yeah. So as you both well know, over the decades, one of the main narratives of the importance of integration or interaction between the U.S., engagement between the U.S. and China, has been the strategic ramifications of that, of avoiding another Cold War of this sort, avoiding a otherwise inevitable seeming great power collision. How do you think now about the strategic implications of this era in U.S.-Chinese relations? Does it make Cold War-style actual strategic and military confrontation more likely?
Well, I guess the way that I would answer that, if we went back to sort of the core debate of China's strategy, the argument was we wanted to avoid a confrontational relationship, and so what we were going to do is we were going to engage them, and through that engagement, their behavior was going to, if not wholly accept, at least move toward the direction of what we called the liberal order, or at least acceptance of something associated with the status quo. The way that I would describe it is, at least if you drew a Venn diagram of what the United States wanted to see in the world, but particularly in Asia, where much of this is going to occur on the military and strategic front. If you drew a diagram of what would be preferable for the United States, what would be preferable for China, there was always a hope that there would be an intersection there, and there was for many decades. I think where we're headed right now is it's actually a null set. There's actually no overlap between Xi Jinping's vision of the strategic picture in Asia and the way American strategists think about it, and that's the fundamental root of the problem. And so from a strategy perspective, the argument had always been the more you engage, the more overlap you would create. And I think the arguments that myself and others have been making is that what we saw over the last decade, and the South China Sea was an example of this, but that the more ground that you gave, the further China pushed, and that they were not slowing down, and that where we are now is the Trump administration coming in. But again, I think the Hillary administration would have had a version of this, of saying enough is enough. And I think, again, it would have looked a little different. And I will say also, just thinking again about where is all this headed, you know, if the Chinese are caught off balance by the Trump administration, you know, that's one thing. But the way that I would look about this, if I were them, is that as I describe the Trump administration, their China policy, I describe it as confrontational without being competitive. And so I think there's a chance, if you got a more sophisticated, more experienced administration in next that had people thinking about the economic competition and the ideological competition and the diplomatic competition and the economic and trade competition, and was firing in a sophisticated way on all fronts, that would be a much more powerful and competitive United States. And China would look back on now as actually child's play to what it could face in the future.
And to follow up on that before turning back to Amy, as you think of the various arenas of this strategic null set Venn diagram, as you're describing, the South China Sea or policies toward Korea or the One Belt, One Road initiative or any other things, which two or three are you most concerned about?
I think the South China Sea is one. Yeah. The situation in Taiwan is another, where again, this question of who started it, Beijing will say the leaders in Taiwan have been provoking, they're not accepting the status quo, but from an outside perspective, Xi Jinping in China really is pushing very hard on this issue. And then I think there is in an area where I'm not sure Beijing understands the kind of deep water it's jumping into here on the governance and ideological issue, where they are pushing in a very, not just to a domestic audience, but to an international audience, talking about how terrible capitalism is and democracy and how their system is superior or an alternative method. I don't think that, if they want to get in a real fight about an ideological competition over their system versus the West, that's one we're willing to have. And I think we're going to potentially move into that space. So that, again, becomes an area where I think could be quite irreconcilable because it is so essential to Xi Jinping's own identity. Yeah.
So, Amy, your views on this strategic matchup between the U.S. and China, including whether the U.S. at this moment is prepared to engage in this sort of battle of ideas, of different models of the future?
Well, I do think one area where our interests completely do overlap is neither side wants to go to war right now. And that is not a small point, because when we think about issues like Taiwan, it has required the United States and China to come to an accommodation on how we deal with that issue. And this is my attempt to remind folks of the importance of engagement. I completely agree with the premise that a more assertive China is making it much more difficult for the United States to continue our engagement with China. But I do think there are reasons why we must. And so an absence of channels of communication and cooperation are going to lead to this likelihood of war to become much greater. And I think that is something where we actually do share a very significant common interest, and so do our allies in the region. That is one thing where I think that all of our allies in East Asia are saying the United States and China at least talking about the problems that they have with one another is much better than us having to choose between the two. And so that is a significant issue that I do think, had there been somebody, a different party in the White House, we would have been more sophisticated, as you're suggesting, in thinking about how do we deal with a more confrontational, assertive China that is trying to undermine the liberal democracy that we have championed for 70 years.
And to follow that, I'm sure you both are familiar with the works of Eric X. Lee, originally Chinese from Shanghai, venture capitalist in the U.S., who then went back to Shanghai and has become sort of the proponent of the new Chinese model of the world, of international order. How much traction do you think that view has in the Chinese leadership of really spoiling for a conflict of models with the U.S.?
Well, I do think, as Eli just laid out, the Chinese government has been pretty clear with its intentions right now in a way that prior to Xi Jinping, the Chinese leadership wasn't so clear. They had their, hide and bide, hide your strength, bide your time. And Xi Jinping has completely disregarded that. I think there's been some pushback in Beijing, wondering if Xi Jinping has gone too far too quickly, while China still is gathering its strength. And so the answer to my question is yes, I do think China does want to challenge the United States. However, I think within China there is a debate about whether now is the time. China does have vulnerabilities that I think they feel like in 10 years from now they might be in a stronger, many citizens feel that way. think the Trump administration in some ways agrees with that, says if we don't stand up to China now, we won't be able to fight this even stronger country a decade from now.
You agree? Yeah.
Well, if I could just put a footnote on that, which is an important point, because there is a debate of this issue of sort of governance models. Is China trying to export a Beijing consensus, and there's some pieces of evidence of that, though it's not very clear. The argument that I would make is that we argue too much about China's intentions. Is the government being intending to export illiberalism? The fact of the matter is, the Communist Party is very focused on domestic stability and economic growth, and the way that it goes about achieving those ends is, in fact, having the effect of spreading illiberalism around the world. And so you see norms around international intervention, or the internet in particular, or media or whatnot, where I think there is a concern where even if you don't have a strategy document in Beijing that says, how do we make more countries in the developing world illiberal, you do see a seeping of liberalism that's a real problem that we need to confront. So we shouldn't get ourselves too much wound around the axle of, are they intending to do this or not?
One debate I often had with journalists in China when we were seeing the latest episode of what looked like needless and surplus oppression, cracking down on people when there's no reason to do so, when it wasn't efficient, which had been sort of a preceding model, was, did this show that the leadership knew more than outside observers did about its own fragility and things they had to worry about, or did they know less? You know, that presumably, and they just were being more brutal than they needed to be. What is your sense of the view from inside the leadership of how concerned they are about their own domestic legitimacy, stability, the various tensions inside China?
That's an extremely important question and impossible to answer.
That's why I turned to the experts.
And a lot of people, look, you'll have very smart people coming down on different sides of that. I think there's no question that Xi Jinping is investing in domestic security, that they're engaging in activities like these, whether it's journalists or lawyers or religious leaders that are being stamped out for ideological purposes. And of course, the events which are now on the front pages of American newspapers of the internment camps out in western China and Xinjiang, where you have reports or estimates of over 1 million people that have been through these, that these are clearly excessive. They're not the actions of a leaders or a leadership that's extremely confident about domestic stability. They also may feel like they have the power to do this, and so they're not going to face retribution for it. So, but it's extremely troubling, and I think this particular turn toward domestic oppression creates real problems in the U.S.-China relationship, particularly when it starts being exported. I think again, no one had fantasies about Jeffersonian democracy in China, but as long as things were inching along a little bit, and the internet was a little more free, and the press was a little more free, and dialogue within universities was a little more free, then I think there was a willingness to forgive a lot of the other things we saw. I think the article that you wrote and others made clear that we're seeing a turn, and it's not clear it's gonna zag back under Xi Jinping's, and that has a lot of people worried.
And what's your sense on whether the current repression is a sign of confidence or insecurity?
Well, I think we can point to other things, like how the Chinese government reacted to the latest vaccine scandal within China as just a sign of how insecure the leadership is, that they had to monitor the coverage of just how significant that had been and the threats to human life in China. And we've seen that in the past, where food safety scandals are swept under the rug because of the concern that this could spill into criticism of the government's handling. And so, yes, I used to think that Xi Jinping probably woke up in the morning and had about 10 issues that he worried about before he started worrying about his relationship with the United States. I think now maybe we're within the top 10 only because this comes directly back to stability within China.
And yet overlaying these, of course, I think there is a sense of their destiny is in the future, and the West and the United States are in relative decline. So I think there's an interesting contradiction between the internal and the external. But at least the Chinese experts and officials that I talk to, you do get a real sense of confidence in the long run and the perception of real instability in the United States here, or the inability of ourselves to get our act together.
We were just to say, Eli and I were at a round table last week with a China scholar who we were pressing him about whether and when China actually is going to start liberalizing its system economically to deal with a slowing growth story. And his phrase was, You know, in China, there's a lot of thunder, but often not a lot of rain. Being his way of saying, yes, the government keeps saying we're on the cusp of opening up wider to foreign investment as a way to stave off criticism, but things aren't changing. And so I do think there is a class in China of people who are observing the system saying, something really does have to change, or else our system is going to become more vulnerable. And Xi Jinping is reacting, I think, to that.
On this cusp of change front, when I was first got to Shanghai about 13 years ago, I was I flew an airplane inside China, and they were on the cusp of liberalizing their military airspace so they could have this thriving, aviation business. They're still on that same cusp. I think it has not changed in that time. Specific question of cyber relations between the U.S. and China. I'd like to get your general perspective and two specific episodes. One is one that I mentioned in an Atlantic article where the Obama administration appeared to back China down from some military sponsorship of corporate spying through various sanctions it put on. The other is Donald Trump's comment last week or so that he thought the Chinese were meddling in our elections. What's your view in general and on those points?
I was involved in the former, so I can speak a little bit about that, but not in great detail. The story of that was the United States obviously had huge amounts of evidence of Chinese cyber theft, intellectual property theft, cyber theft for commercial gain, had considered punitive action against China for the sake of doing that. The Chinese sent a very high-level delegation to Washington on the eve of a visit by Xi Jinping, which, if it had occurred around the time of the punitive actions, would have been perceived as an embarrassment to President Xi. And a deal was struck around cyber norms that many in the Obama administration read as the beginning of some reduction in that kind of activity, and people drew different lessons from that. The engagement accommodation crowd said, look, we can work with these guys. The more hawkish side said, no, don't you see, you have to stand up to them and make threats to get what you want. So people drew different lessons from that. I think the activity has increased and been done in other ways. So to me, it's from what I've seen, less of a victory than people claim it is, but it was an important learning incident. I think on this last question of election interference, I will only say about this that I think there is there. It's different than what Russia has done, but China is engaged in information operations in the United States. The United Front and other parts of their government are very explicit about this, and at least in their official media, we see very targeted information operations. There was the incident that Trump said this around of a China Daily insert, paid insert inside the Des Moines Register newspaper, criticizing how the tariffs were affecting farmers in Iowa. I mean, that's splashing it across the front page. They may be engaged in other more subtle activities to try to weaken Trump's support around the tariffs, and I think there is evidence to that. Vice President Pence is going to be giving a speech tomorrow, I believe. Well, he'll be addressing some of these in more detail. We'll see what kind of specific evidence he comes out with, but this is not the last we've heard of this issue.
And Amy, how about your clients in the business and educational world? How do cyber issues affect them? How do they see this threat growing, changing, diminishing?
Yeah, they clearly have felt the impact of this and do believe that it is a very significant concern for them. So much so that if they're really truly confidential issues that you don't want to discuss, you don't discuss them over email. We don't either with our clients. We've tried to use codes to talk about, if deals are in the offing, but it is very, very challenging recognizing that the Chinese are monitoring communications. Now, of course, we know our intelligence services monitor information as well and communications. However, I don't think the Chinese are thinking that the U.S. government is handing over to GE information that could help them compete with a Chinese company. And that's what we were seeing, what our clients were feeling. And then for our clients, of course, in the education space, just being concerned about influence operations, we come back to this issue of throwing out the baby baby with the bathwater of what do you do about it? How do we strengthen norms so that we can prevent sensitive information from being sent back to the Chinese government? I think all of us probably in this room would say that restricting Chinese from coming to the United States to study is not the answer. And so it requires just a level of sophistication that, back to my clients, they feel like our government isn't providing, and so the target on their back is getting bigger in this environment.
And I'll just say, maybe just for folks who haven't spent as much time on the cyber issue, because I think this is important to the question of why hasn't the United States government done more about this. It's a really hard problem, because for the United States to do something like exact sanctions on these issues, the burden of evidence required within the Justice Department or elsewhere is actually quite high, and it's not the case often that that an American company is making a widget, the Chinese company steals the plans to the widget and starts reproducing the widget. It's often much more subtle things associated with processes or otherwise, or trade secrets or whatnot, so it can be very difficult to get the level of paper trail you would need to have a retaliatory action.
And just one final question or follow-up question on information operations. The allegation about Russian involvement over the past few years has been that sowing disruption just for its own sake was good in the United States, on racial grounds, on any other sort of grounds. To me, that's different from a China Daily insert saying oppose the soybean tariffs. And do you think is there evidence of the Chinese operations just wanting to sow discord in the U.S. for its own sake?
I don't think we've seen evidence of that. I think your assessment that the Russian activity is different from the Chinese activity is a really important one, and the Chinese tend to either distract or muddle a message or try to create favorable views of China, but I don't think they're as interested in undermining yet American democracy in the way Putin has been.
Yeah.
I agree with that, and I would just remind everybody that, of course, the Europeans and their retaliatory tariffs targeted Trump supporters too. And so that action, completely agree, is not in any way like Russian action to undermine the U.S. system. China's not alone, though, in pursuing Trump voters to try to dissuade them from continuing to support the president.
So I have one more theme I want to arrange with you all, and then we'll have questions, which is when I was living in China and getting sicker by the day because of the water and the food and the air and all the rest, I wrote many times that a fundamental reason for U.S.-Chinese engagement was environmental progress. So if the two of them did not work together on climate issues and other solutions, just there was no hope for anybody. Has any sort of traction, engagement, progress between U.S. and China on this front survived?
Well, it was surprising to me to hear that China sent a 100-person delegation to the California Conference on Climate Change just this past month, and including the lead NDRC State Planning Commission negotiator for climate change. And so I do think there are interests in the United States at the subnational level in continuing this dialogue with China, and I was encouraged to see that that was continuing despite our two national governments not continue to prioritize that issue.
And also I would just add that, you know, if you wound back a decade, it was the U.S. Embassy having to put out information about air quality totals because of the social and economic implications of this. This is an imperative for China, so we're not in a dynamic any longer where the United States needs to be pulling the Chinese government along to care about these issues.
And do you know whether specific projects on carbon recapture or solar energy research, all the rest, have they continued? Do you happen to know that were underway during the Obama time?
I'm not sure about that on the policy side. On the industry side, I think one of the concerns that American companies right now have is whether enhanced export controls could restrict some of that cooperation if it's seen as dual use.
Okay. Let me turn it to you all. Yes, we can start here. Yes.
What impact do you think the Indo-Pacific Command will have, and also a tightening or coming together of Japan, India, and the U.S. security-wise?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
So this is a good question. The Obama administration had a large strategic frame for their Asia strategy around a rebalance to Asia. What the Trump administration has put forward to date is this concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And there are differences between them. One of the major differences is that within the U.S. rebalance, within the Obama administration's rebalance to Asia, it was about focusing on Asia, working with our allies and partners. But the affirmative agenda with China was a huge part of that, trying to build a positive relationship with China, work in the region, work in the world. And it was mostly confined to primarily East Asia and Southeast Asia. The free and open Indo-Pacific, as I read it, is about stretching the map wider to include India, to dilute both the economic and security influence of China, and it's completely devoid of that affirmative agenda of China, and instead trying to build more mechanisms with India and Australia and Japan and others. So I think that's a right read on where they're trying to go.
And the ambassador to China is from Iowa?
Yeah, Terry Branstad, former governor, yes.
That's why
Yeah.
they placed it in the Des Moines paper.
And then he wrote a retort just a few days later, which quite strongly worded, interestingly.
So we have, expectedly, we have about a bazillion questions, so I'll just sort of sweep this way. Yes.
Thank you, and thank the panel. I'd like to address my question to the panel. My name is Edward Gibson. I'm President and CEO of Eastern One, and I'm interested in knowing, given the comments about the South China Sea and the policies of Trump and Obama, if we'd be in the same situation there now had sequestration not occurred under Obama when he tried to pivot to Asia and was inhibited by budgetary cuts.
And I will be looking for sort of concise two-sentence style answers.
The concise answer to this is that the failing of U.S. policy in the South China Sea is not a failing of capability. It's a failing of the United States to take risk when it needed to. It's been too risk averse.
Yeah. I completely agree with that.
So yes, here, yes. So wait for a second. Here you go. And if you could identify yourself, please. Yes.
Thank you. Sherry Stevenson, ICTSD Geneva. To what extent was the TPP, now the CPTPP, a lost opportunity for the United States? In your view, we know trade agreements are also political agreements in the end. Is there any other option for rebuilding that kind of alliance that might serve the U.S. aims to curb China?
Post-TPP.
Well, it was not just a lost opportunity for the United States. It was a great gift to China that the United States withdrew. But I am hopeful on that. I have to believe that as the Trump administration continues to try to renegotiate multilateral trade agreements and then focus on bilats, they may return to the idea of the benefit vis-a-vis China of having a strong, larger trade partnership.
You have a TPP view, or
Yeah, very much shared. I think from the question of the political effects and the security effects, countries in the region are making decisions every day about how much they're going to be willing to stick their necks out, push back on Chinese coercion or certain economic and security, and often they premise those decisions on their perceptions of the future. And if they perceive the inevitability of a China-led economic order, then they're not going to take risk, for instance, in the South China Sea. If they believe that it's going to be more mixed, that there are going to be economic alternatives and security alternatives, and the United States is going to be playing its traditional role, then we may see a very different picture, particularly in Southeast Asia, of state activity. So I think the concern with TPP, there's the economic realities of it, and then there are the effects of, on the security side of countries, seeing it as China's ascendancy in the context of American decline in the region.
So we're going to go here and then here, and I'm going to ask my microphone team to preemptively identify people with their hands up, and I'll just go to whoever has a microphone. Yes.
Hi, I'm Shelley Porgas. I'm the co-founder and managing partner of the $1 Billion Fund for Women, a global consortium of venture funds committed to investing in more women. The largest or the hottest, I should say, new unicorn in China is VIP Kids, which was founded by a woman, a 30-something-year-old woman. I think she's 32 now. And her VIP Kids is teaching tens of millions of Chinese children English. All over, by recruiting American teachers, by the way. She's Uberizing education. Beyond that, 70% of Chinese parents say that they want their children to learn English. What impact is that going to have on the next generation? You talked about engagement and so forth. And even the Chinese government, I understand, I don't know if this is true, is requiring their state workers who are under 45 years old to memorize, I guess, 1,000 English phrases or something like that. So with that thought in mind and that kind of...
hurting the feelings of the Chinese people.
Yeah, what impact will that have on the next generation as they all know English and, P.S., we probably don't all know Chinese?
I have a carriage house in my backyard, and my tenant actually is one of those teachers. So she gets up at 4 o'clock in the morning and online teaches Chinese students one at a time in the houses of the Chinese students from 4 until 7 every day. And she says the Chinese parents often get on and say, "Can I just hire you directly and not go through VIP kids?"
This is China.
Ingenious. Yes, I think that this interest in China, in continuing to be an international society, is obviously growing. But I will give you one counterpoint. I was speaking with some Google executives about their future in China, and one of them said to me, "Well, you know, we have a problem with brand recognition in China because young people don't know Google. They only know, of course, the Chinese competitor." Now, that's just one piece of information, but I think it speaks to two things. One, there's a demand on the VIP kids side for Chinese students not only to learn English, but to have international experiences that they can then bring back to China to help themselves working in China one day. But two, we are seeing more and more that there are restrictions between young people outside of China and in China that the Chinese government makes, and I hope the United States doesn't reinforce.
And I'll preempt you, Eli, for a second by saying that English language has been a mandatory subject on university entrance exams in China for a long time, for many decades. Yeah, so yes, here and then over here. Yeah.
Hi, Ken Levinson with the Washington International Trade Association. Back in the 90s, there were people, we were looking at Russia with its messy democracy, and I remember a smart person, it may have been you, Mr. Fallows, said that watch in 50 years, maybe Russia's probably going to be less democratic than China. That was 20 years ago. We're 30 years out from that prediction. Where do you see that going?
The Russian-Chinese comparison. Also, for the record, I've never said China would become democratic, but compared to, but anyhow, Russia-China compare and contrast.
I'm going to take this question in a slightly different direction, because I don't have a prediction about the future of Chinese democracy, but I will say one of the concerning elements about Xi Jinping and the current state of Chinese authoritarianism is that they're starting to employ new tools, and particularly high technology tools, to monitor Chinese citizens and otherwise. And I think the ideas about the ways in which disagreement or not rebellion, but the way antibodies to this kind of authoritarianism would grow in the past perhaps could be even more easily stamped out now than in the future. So this is just to say the tools of authoritarianism are getting quite sophisticated, and I think that may extend the rule of this kind of system longer than it might otherwise.
So we have over here and then over here. Yes.
John Dykers, Chair Emeritus of the Thursday Morning Intellectual Society. Do you think the calligraphic versus alphabetic form of a written word is going to be more or less important as we go through the digital age and artificial intelligence?
Interesting. Whether calligraphy, whether the age of artificial intelligence will help or impede calligraphic language. I have a view on this, but I'm curious.
I am afraid I am not equipped to answer that question. However, I will say, you know, for American companies, China's just incredible focus on the development of artificial intelligence means that our companies want to be in China so that we don't miss out on some of that innovation happening in China. We are a great innovative nation, but we don't want to continue to just innovate in a petri dish. We want to be able to be participating where artificial intelligence is also making incredible inroads, and China is one of those places.
I'll just say, having spent endless hours learning to read and write Chinese, I think the technologies of the and you have to do that if you want to get to a point of anything nearing fluency. It may be that some of these translation technologies actually reduce barriers for people to be able to engage directly, whether it's reading or listening or talking in conversation, and that could actually help China a lot because it is a big barrier for people who want to engage and debate with the Chinese.
And computerized pinyin entry systems made it a lot easier to write in Chinese. Yes. Yeah.
Yes, Jerry Hagstrom, the Hagstrom Report and National Journal. I write about agriculture, and those tariffs really have hurt soybean exports. Do you think that U.S. agriculture has become too dependent on the Chinese market? And what would you say to companies of all types that are still trying to, or hoping that they will increase their exports to China in the future?
Well, I have a number of agricultural clients, and I can tell you that, you know, they'll sell where the markets are. And of course, China is this incredible growth story of demand. And so that's really why we're seeing so much focus on the China market among some of our American exporters in the ag sector. Their concern right now is, will tariffs allow Brazil, Canada, obviously Europe, to replace them? And it's so difficult to get back market share once you lose it. And so obviously I think this week there's a significant sigh of relief over the new NAFTA moving forward for agricultural interests. But with China, they are absolutely here in Washington, on the one hand, trying to be as forceful as possible to explain the benefits of trade to public policy officials here, but I think on the other hand are having the least effective ability to change minds, both in Congress and with the administration, in recent history. And I think part of that is because the argument that China is manipulating the United States is a reason to take action. And this administration has chosen tariffs as that action they will take. Is that going to help the problem or harm it? The jury's out, but I can tell you agricultural interests here are saying we see 2019 and we see the impact being on these farmers. They don't have other markets to be selling their products to.
So I'm going to propose we hear the question on this side and we hear the question on this side, and then you answer them en bloc. Yes.
Thank you. I told my name already, so I'll keep it brief. I'm interested in hearing about Taiwan, whether we're strategically aligned and an appropriate future for Taiwan, and if not, what should it be?
Taiwan and over here. Oh, yeah. Great.
Hi, I'm Andrew Oros from Washington College. In the last sort of 10 years, it seems like there was a counter-narrative that I often heard about a future weak China, you know, with a graying society, a shrinking labor market, a competition from other countries, environmental issues, and then also the political control issue that did come up a little bit today. But I just wonder, is that sort of not something we think about now? In the security realm before, I think we would often talk about biding. It was the U.S. that needed to bide time, and that in 15 years from now or so, China's not going to be so much of a problem. It just strikes me that that just didn't come up at all in the panel. So maybe that's just not a thing anymore.
So first Eli and then Amy on how to think about Taiwan concisely and whose side history is on.
I'm just going to take this second one, which is to say, I think there are people who are still thinking that way, but the next 10 years are really critical. And so, and even if China starts to have demographic and environmental and social issues that kick in and slow its growth, the amount of change and path-dependent change that it can create in the South China Sea and regional institutions is so fundamental that waiting for that to happen is not going to work for the United States. So I think no matter where you see the 10-year projection, you need to push back through this period of confidence, and we'll see what happens when we get there.
I completely agree. I will just reinforce that certainly the leaders of China are still worried about that list of issues that you discussed. And that was what was motivating the government to try to change the way that the economy grows. Unfortunately, China hasn't implemented the reforms that they said they would in order to deal with some of those challenges that are going to happen. One question, I think, is can technology help China with some of those issues that it couldn't, 10 years ago? On Taiwan, again, I really do, unfortunately, blame the Chinese again for changing the status quo here. The Chinese have been much more aggressive and assertive in restricting the ability of Taiwan to operate in the global economy in any political issue. And that is forcing the United States to respond in a way that, unfortunately, I don't think necessarily adheres to the agreement our two countries made when we normalized relations and set the Taiwan relations transact. And so China is playing a very dangerous game right now, I think driven by a lot of confidence that in fact, Taiwan will become part of China eventually. Probably, I would have said, yes, there is a likelihood that could happen in a peaceful way. And ironically, Xi Jinping is diminishing the possibility of that by pushing so hard.
So Eli, a final word on Taiwan.
Just that the one, I agree with what Amy said, the one factor she didn't mention is the effect that this is having on views inside Taiwan itself. And I think that the desire to join the mainland only gets lower and lower and lower as Xi Jinping both changes China to be more authoritarian internally and continues pressing on the neck of the island.
Yeah. So there's much more to discuss, but we've covered a tremendous amount, and our panelists have done it really well. So please join me in thanking Amy and Eli.
Yep. I reiterate, Jim, thank you to our panel. Thank you all for being here. We've got a lot more in store today. We're going to be back at the main stage at the Harmon Center at 2 p.m. And in the first hour, we've got a couple schedule changes, but you make your way back there for Chef Jose Andres, John Kerry, and Kamala Harris. You won't want to miss it. Thank you very much. Thank you all again. One more for the panel.